Hari Om. In 1936, Paramahansa Yogananda returned to India and then toured throughout the entire country, meeting holy men and women. And during that visit to the south, he visited Tiruvannamalai and visited the sage of Arunachala, Sri Ramana Maharshi. During their brief encounter, Master Yogananda asked the Maharshi, why is it so that we suffer so much? Why mankind has to endure such profound suffering, almost on every level of their being, seemingly relentlessly, with only brief respites, brief delays of happiness and rest, only to be tumbled back into suffering of some form or another. Suffering from want, gain, loss, illness, and just aging and the inevitability of death. The Maharshi looked at Yogananda when he asked this question, and he said, suffering is the way to self-realization. Then Yoganandaji said, well, within God's omnipotence, mercy, and compassion, couldn't he just alleviate to some degree the abject suffering that mankind endures seemingly from life to life to life? Then the Maharshi became, those around him said he became somewhat stern and said, it is the way. So the question is that we ask ourselves, how could suffering be a way to self-realization? Because what suffering engenders is loss of faith, despair, and even worse, in many, hate. And then this hate becomes malignant because you hate those who are causing suffering, and then we attribute that to a higher realm, and we, in a sense, become disgusted and perhaps even hateful toward God, the creator of all that happens to us. So in an effort to try to shed light on how suffering could be a way to realization, I would like to read briefly a section from a wonderful book by Ili Hillesum called A Life Transformed. She was a young lady from Holland who was imprisoned during World War II and actually died in Auschwitz. But she left diaries of her suffering and her triumph, and how she came to find a way to realization through this suffering. So I'll read this, and then I think we'll get a good idea of how we can apply certain of these experiences into our own life. This section is called Lover and Beloved. These are the words from the diary of Eddie, the words of a lover offering flowers, scented jasmine, to her beloved. And there is vulnerability and need in both, the giver and that one who is being given to. And so, out of the crucible of the Holocaust emerged a profound theology of vulnerable presence, with a capital P, meaning the vulnerability of God himself, which led this extraordinary young woman to triumph over the evil that threatened to engulf her. But what she achieved was not based on sentiment. Her triumph was the fruit of a remarkable discipline developed over a very short span of time, as she battled against the power of the menace all around her, which overshadowed everything. She knew that if she gave in to it, it would weaken and destroy her. And so as the clamor of the fears rise, she cultivates an inner solitude. And so, as the contagion of the fear spreads, she practices an inner detachment. As the cancer of fear eats away the spirit of those around her, she rigorously is watchful against it in her own mind. As she cries, and as the cries of the fear become an awful cacophony, she learns to listen deeply to the silence of her own heart. As she faces up and accepts what the fear points to, their inevitable end, she consciously nourishes a profound inner freedom. At the heart of this rigorously disciplined inner life opened a mystery of the divine experienced within her as a vulnerable presence. It was this that fortified her refusal to hate. So in the midst of the most abject suffering, she found a place, a refuge, a safe harbor. And although the cacophony of death and the most abject suffering caused by the inhumane and unimaginable treatment that she and those who endured, and the hardships of life beyond human imagination, she found an inner place. This is what is referred to in the Bhagavad Gita and the Bible, when, especially in the Bhagavad Gita, where Sri Krishna is explaining the word surrender. He said, surrender your consciousness to the inner shelter and inner harbor of my benevolent being. So this is what Eddie found, that there was a place, a still place amidst all the darkness. This same experience was experienced and discussed by Betty and Tessie Tenbaum, who also were young ladies who experienced the same concentration camp imprisonment, where in the midst of the most abject suffering, those around, Miss Tenbaum said, God cannot be here. This place is too hideous, too dark, too abominable. And then in response she said, there is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. So we find what the saints, the Maharshis, the masters, the scriptures, and what our own heart and mind are trying to tell us, that we suffer, but there is a still small place of silence within our heart and being. And if we can cultivate that, we will find freedom there. To end, I'd like to tell you a brief story of St. Anthony the Great. He was the Desert Father, one of the first Desert Fathers who lived in the 3rd and into the 4th century. He lived in the desert for over 40 years, being fed literally by God, as a dove came down from heaven with a warm loaf of bread every 2 or 3 days and gave it to him. The Divine Mother of God, the Blessed Virgin Mary, appeared, set her foot on the ground at the cave where he was dwelling, and water came forth. Water is gushing forth and nourishing the monastery in St. Anthony's name to this day. And he lived a life like an angel on earth. Though suffering, unable to cure his own illness, he cured the illnesses of those who came before him. He was a miracle worker. So at the end of his life, those around him said, "O Holy Father, can you give us a bit of advice that we may have a glimmer of the glory that you experience from your Divine Father, and the glory that comes from your glorious Mother?" And he said, "I'll tell you, if you do this one thing, you'll not only have a glimmer of my accomplishment and glory, if you want to call it glory, but you will surpass me." And so he said this, "When you fall, you rise. When you fall, you rise. When you fall, you rise." When we have difficulties and suffering in life, somehow, and most assuredly through calling on God, we can just dust off and rise again, and be prepared for the next time that we fall, and we'll rise in assurance that ultimately the end is good. Hari Om.